when you look for the first mentions of fishing in Arkansas, lo and behold, where do you find them? Well, you go to the DeSoto narratives. And there were narratives. There were three important narratives that were written by de Biedmas. De Biedma was an officer in DeSoto's army and on the expedition, and the account of his narrative was recorded within and published within a year or two of their return to Spain. So this was regarded as a fairly accurate portrayal of DeSoto's expedition. If you don't know, DeSoto spent a year in Arkansas, and he died in Arkansas. So this account is interesting because you see two things here. You see an account of after they crossed the Grand River, the River Grande, or Grande, which was the Mississippi. They enter into Arkansas and probably go northeastward along the St. Francis River area somewhere, where they encounter some swamps. But there's a village there that they spend a considerable time at. And one of the interesting things was about this village was that there was a canal there that was built, which enabled fish to come out of the river into the canal, and then they would kind of go one way into a pond area where they would be kept. And the chief, it says here, would keep them for his eating and pastime. So it wasn't just a subsistence kind of fishing, it was also a recreational fishing. And then the next interesting thing about the narrative is that it describes that many of the fish here, specifically talking about the catfish, these were the fish that were called bagre, mostly head, and along the sides great spines with very sharp aws. That's obviously talking about a catfish. He says that they weighed up to 100 to 150 pounds. If that was the true pound range of the fish, then it was probably a blue cat. And it says many were taken with the hook. So we've got some definite early references. This would have been mid-1500s. But later accounts of Arkansas exploration find no mention of the thriving American settlements that DeSoto's accounts mentioned, and references to fishing are absent. And then when you look at the early settlement accounts, I've read Nuttall's journal, Schoolcraft's journal, Gerstaker's Wild Sports in the Far West, about their journeys through the state. You don't find any specific references to fishing in Arkansas that I can remember. Nuttall's journal, he mentions buffalo carp, but those are in the Grand River system in northeast Oklahoma. So Schoolcraft doesn't have any real references to fishing, which is interesting because as they came down, he hunted. They shot turkey and deer to sustain their journey, but nothing recording fishing. And they did go along the North Fork River down to the White, and then floated later from Beaver Creek, which is, they went all the way up to the James River, but actually floated the river from Beaver Creek, which is on the upper end of Bull Shoals Lake now, down to Batesville. And there are no instances of accounts of fishing. So how did fly fishing come to Arkansas? Well, we have one episode of a case of Paul Young. He was born in Cherry Valley in northeast Arkansas. He went to Jonesboro A&M, but he had to drop out of school. His family, his father, they had a sharecropping arrangement, and his father, during the Depression, his father left and was never heard from again. And so in order for him to fulfill the agreement with the sharecropping, he dropped out of school and helped on the farm. But a family traveling from Michigan comes through the area, and this family who came by car, and they fly fished. They'd taken it up as a recent hobby. They didn't do well with it, and when they left the gear with Paul Young. And then he later went on to travel. He traveled in Europe. He finally settled in Detroit, Michigan, and he opened an outfitting store. He, somewhere along the way, had learned to build bamboo fly rods. He became a very well-respected fly rod builder, and then opened his outfitting store and sold sporting good merchandise. Another curiosity is that about Paul is that when the Arkansas Trout Unlimited chapters were started, at first they were started in Michigan in the 50s, and one of the chapters that was formed around in the Detroit area was named after Paul Young, so it's called the Paul H. Young chapter of Trout Unlimited. So that was just one kind of episode of how fly fishing kind of came to the state. It came from without to within. Some of the first newspaper accounts I've seen of people coming to fly fish around the town of Norfolk involved travel by train from Batesville to Norfolk. And this would have been about 1925 when the editor of the paper took several of his staff on a trip on the train up to Norfolk to fly fish. Now, by the 1920s, state and federal agencies were reporting that fishermen were willing to travel up to 200 miles for good fishing. And state parks and hatchery facilities were seeing large crowds of visitors for holiday weekends by 1925. So you can see the influence of a simple thing like the automobile, how that made travel really affordable and possible for average kinds of families. Now, this is from the Baxter Bulletin, May 24th, 1935. It says, flycasters from Oklahoma, Missouri, and Arkansas have filled the hotels at this place and at Norfolk since the opening of the bass fishing season on the 16th. The White, North Fork, and Buffalo Rivers all have been in fine shape for casting, and nearly everyone has taken their string of limits of bass. By far the greatest number of bass that have been taken are the smallmouth, the gamiest fighter that inhabits the streams of the Arkansas Ozarks. So you had people finding more freedom for time and leisure as things progress into the 1900s. But post-World War II era, that really opened up the recreation industry and leisure industry. What equipment was available to fly fishers? Well, at first, equipment was mostly from English import. It included bamboo rods, reels, silk lines, gut leaders. Mass production of bamboo rods became common in America by companies like Hedden and Montague. Herders from Minnesota. Herders and like mail order companies began to expand fishing tackle in their catalogs. In 1937, bass fly rods commonly were made up to 9.5 feet and weighed 6 to 7 ounces. That's a heavy rod. Jack Lamb, who was a well-known Texas fisherman and fished all over the South, promoted rods by Fred C. Devine Company in Utica, New York, South Bend Bait Company of South Bend, Indiana, and Weber Lifelike Fly Company of Stevens Point, Wisconsin. And they cost from about $30 to $65 for a rod. Cheap fly rods could be had for as little as $8. And Martin, a reel company at that time, offered an automatic fly reel by the 1950s. This was a reel that basically the tensioner was a spring. And so as you pulled out line, you got more and more line out, that spring would tighten up. So it was kind of an automatic drag system too as you got more line out. Dave Whitlock, a well-known fly fisherman that's got some Arkansas connections. Well, some of his first trips over to Cotter, where he stayed at the commercial hotel, but he said you could get a room for $1.50 a night at that time. If you stayed on the resorts in the 50s around Bull Shoals Lake, you'd pay $15 to $25 for a room. He was a chemist in Bartlesville, Oklahoma, working for the petroleum industry, and he said he would come over for the weekends with a box of woolly boogers, and he would fish for the weekend, and he would get big rainbows on, and as that line came out off that automatic reel and that line would tighten up, it would pop off that tippet, that fly and tippet. And so he said when he'd go back home, he'd have used up all his woolly boogers, his box of flies, and he'd have to buy or tie some more. Between World War I and World War II, steel rods became available. You can see ads pretty often in sporting magazines back around the 50s or so for these steel rods, and they were two-piece generally, or perhaps a one-piece rod. And they did truly cast like a telephone pole. So American tackle companies proliferate. You had steel rods becoming available, and Pfluger Company of Akron, Ohio, introduces in 1931 the Medalist fly reel. The company was founded in 1881 as the Enterprise Manufacturing Company and E.A. Pfluger Company. The company begins by making glass minnows. I'd love to see one of those. It was called a luminous crystal minnow. And it was a manufacturer of fishing tackle, harness trimmings, and metal specialties. And that's characteristic of a lot of these small fly tackle companies. They would make other things, and they would delve into fly fishing tackle. In 1886, Pfluger takes over the American Fish Hook Company of New Haven, Connecticut. And it begins to make the Pfluger bait cast reel in 1916. And soon it is the leading fishing reel producer in the United States. It receives a patent in 1930 for the Medalist fly reel, which probably is one of the all-time best-selling fly reels in the country. And then Pfluger introduced the spinning reel in 1954. John Cross, banker in Eureka Springs, was a guide when the Riverview Resort was first built there by the bridge, the 62 bridge. And he guided on the Kings River and on the White River, and he tells stories about using fly rods to fish in the 50s on the White River, and they would often use bait on the fly rods. They would hook up bait and they would catch catfish on the fly rod. He said it was a great deal of fun, but in addition to fishing popping bugs and other flies for smallmouth. Shakespeare Company was founded in Kalamazoo, Michigan in 1897 with a dozen employees. During World War I, Shakespeare Company factory was converted to manufacture mortar fuses and automobile carburetors. It grows to 5,000 dealers by 1920. It produces the Wonder Reel with a backlash brake on it, a bait cast reel. And then in World War II, the company had contracts to build controls for aircraft, tanks, and jeeps. In 1947, under Henry Shakespeare, the son, it produces the fiberglass Wonder Rod and makes mass-produced bamboo and steel rods obsolete. By 1970, much of the production and corporate offices moved to Columbia, South Carolina. J.C. Higgins is another old tackle company whose rods and reels were built by various major manufacturers over the years, and they were known as a Sears brand. So there is a Shakespeare-Pfluger connection. In 1965, Shakespeare moved the reel production. Remember, it had acquired, or is about to acquire, Pfluger. It moves the reel production from Kalamazoo, Michigan, to a new plant in Fayetteville, Arkansas. The plant was one of the first in the country to treat polluted factory wastewater and return it purified and filtered for reuse. So in 1966, Shakespeare acquires Pfluger, and it continues to produce the Medalist and also Orvis Madison reels. In 1982, operations in Arkansas were closed and moved to Columbia, South Carolina, and now all Shakespeare facilities are located in Columbia. A lot of their reels subsequently were Medalist reels were made in Japan and then later Korea. So what's the state of fisheries in Arkansas? I'll go through this quickly. The 1800s to 1920s was an era of depletion. The era of wildlife and fish destruction is well documented. At the same time this is going on, the U.S. Fisheries Bureau is feverishly stocking trout and salmon in the rivers and streams. You had the Neosho Fish Hatchery in Neosho, Missouri, which is the oldest fish hatchery in the country. It was responsible for stocking trout and even salmon in a lot of the headwaters of these streams. What they found in the late 1800s was that a lot of these cold water springs would support trout for a mile or two down before the water became too warm. But they eventually gave up on salmon stocking. It became too expensive, and they started mass-producing trout eggs and planting and stocking trout all over. There are accounts of Neosho Fish Hatchery stocking the Cotter Spring in Cotter, Arkansas, about 1920. So at the same time that the U.S. Fisheries Bureau, which is the predecessor of U.S. Fish and Wildlife, at the same time they're feverishly stocking trout and salmon in the rivers and streams, locals are resorting to all manners of illegal harvest methods, including fish traps, dynamite, high-powered rifles, and electrofishing. Anyone know how they electrofished, poached? There was an old device called the telephone, except it was the crank telephone. And that crank on the telephone box was a generator, electric generator, and so they would use that. U.S. Fish and Wildlife, or Fisheries Bureau, was planting all these trout, but people were taking them out as fast as they could put them in. An article published in the Cotter Courier from 1904 tells of a 350-mile float trip down the James River and the White Rivers from Aurora, Missouri, to Cotter. That's got to be wrong. That's not 350 miles. It must be 150 miles. And the floating party consisted mostly of railroad men and a rider. And the rider accounts that they floated along. All manners of fish were seen: bass, 3 kinds. That would have been largemouth, smallmouth, and spotted. Rainbow trout, jack salmon. Anyone know what a jack salmon was? This was a walleye, which were native to the White River system. Buffalo, red horse, suckers, and enormous catfish. Not the flabby fish that congregate at the mouth of city sewers, but large, firm-fished, fighting fellows that give the fishermen all they want to do to handle them on a rod and line. However, these fish are being rapidly killed, and the river in time will have no fish in it on account of the murderous fish traps scattered every 5 to 10 miles along the river. These are built from bank to bank, and at the lower end of a large, slow-flowing part of the river. They are 3 to 5 feet high, built of rock, and in the center, where the force of the current is greatest, the trap is built about 10 feet long and 6 feet wide. This trap is made of slats close together that the water can run through. On the lower end is built a box, and at this season of the year, the fish are following their usual instinct to go downriver. They are, by the force of the current, brought into the trap, and all night long the natives of the community are there removing the largest and best fish, throwing away hundreds of tons of small fish that have been killed by the crowding together in the traps. We passed 22 of these traps, and at each we had to remove a section before we could get our boats through. So on the lower end of the river, you had a different kind of thing going on. You had, on the lower end of the river, fish poaching was going on, and they would string wire across the rivers, and they would send out notices to people not to be caught with a rod and line in the river. In the 1920s, you had an era of early fisheries conservation. I was surprised to learn that the Isaac Walton League, which is mostly known as an East Coast conservation organization, a lot of fly fishermen belong to the Isaac Walton League, but it was active in Arkansas in the 1920s, and it boasted 10,000 members in the state. Nowadays, there's not a presence of the Isaac Walton League. We have a fraction of conservation groups and all kinds of special interest groups, and at that time, Isaac Walton League was the major conservation group to belong to, and it had a presence in the state. The state, during this time in the 20s, began the hatcheries program, where they would rear fish and then put them back into the rivers. Everybody was crying out for a hatchery near them. There's even a newspaper clipping I found in Bentonville, where they were pushing, about that time frame, they were pushing to get a trout hatchery put in at Bentonville. And there were hence further anti-poaching laws. U.S. Fisheries Bureau said as Arkansas faced a shortage of fish and they had trouble keeping up with the replenishing of the rivers, the U.S. Fisheries Bureau said, we'll continue to help you stock, but you're going to have to put some laws on the books where you can't poach. and you can't use dynamite, you can't use telephones. And so those laws started showing up from the legislature. From the 1940 period to 66, you had an increase in big dam and numerous lake building programs. Not only the big reservoirs, but small lakes like Lake Conway. Lake Conway was a wonderful lake when it was first built, and it had a fly fishing for bass became very popular on the lake, using popping bugs and other small flies. And then later, because of the big lakes, you had introduction of trout into the cold water environments that were created because of the high head dams. The only naturally occurring lakes, they were the oxbow lakes that were left over down in the delta from the meanderings of the rivers, where they would cut through and leave the bend of the river, bypass the bend of the river, and that would become a lake called an oxbow lake. But because of 1927 and the Great Mississippi Flood, which flooded this area as well in the White River, congressional authorization and the flood control acts followed. It's interesting to read some of the observations of the planning documents that were put forth by the Corps of Engineers. They talked about the Arkansas being deficit in reservoirs, but they would soon correct such an oversight by the Creator and make Arkansas become the land of lakes and the land of the Great Lakes of the Ozarks. So that's the 5 big White River reservoirs were referred to as the Great Lakes of the Ozarks. And then from 66 to today, you had the evolution of modern fisheries management and game fish programs. Perhaps one of the biggest influences was Joe Brooks. Joe Brooks was nationally known. He was probably the best known angling author in the United States during this period of time. He wrote this complete fishing guide to fishing across North America. Brooks's influence and national reputation and kind of putting all this destination information out really brought attention to the fly fishing opportunities in Arkansas. Another influence was Dave Whitlock, who was the research chemist over in Bartlesville, who decided to change careers midstream and become a professional fly fisherman. He's gone on to build a world-class fly fishing school. He writes, he speaks. He and his wife Emily travel and fish worldwide, and they also are involved in conservation projects and promoting trout fishing and fly fishing. Arkansas Game and Fish starts their trout stamp program in 1971. Brown trout, curiously, did not show up on the stamp until 1985, when they hired their first trout biologist, Mark Huddy, who was interested in coming up with some regulations to protect brown trout so that they could grow to a trophy size. So really, by 1985, you were starting to get a focus on trying to make the brown trout species a trophy species for the tailwater system. Trout Unlimited and Game and Fish began a new 5-year wild Bonneville cutthroat program below Bull Shoals and Norfolk Dams in 2010. The program extended to beaver tailwater in 2015. If you're familiar with cutthroat at all, you may have heard something about the Yellowstone cut. Well, the Yellowstone cutthroat is noted for these big, bold, black spots, but they only start about midway back and they go into the tail. The Bonnevilles look very similar, except the spots start closer to the head. And so that's the way you can tell a Bonneville versus a Yellowstone cutthroat. But Bonneville cut are native to Utah drainages. They're supposed to do well in this area, so we'll see. Fine spot cutthroat, these were actually introduced into the White River I think 1 year only, back in the 70s. And they probably weren't successful because it takes sustained program to get these fish going. They face a lot of natural chances that they have to survive in order to make it up to a catchable fish. Predation, and then just surviving, getting out of the rocks. River conditions. Snake River from Jackson Hole, Wyoming. Snake River fine spotted cut. The Game and Fish usually stocks as a small stockable fish. We have an exchange program with Wyoming Department of Wildlife where we send them catfish and they send us cutthroat. Now you say, why is that important? They're not native. Well, the ecosystem is forever changed below those dams. They're cold water environments now. They never will be a cool water environment for smallmouth, suitable for smallmouth reproduction again. Even though we still have stretches of the river where there are smallmouth that come out of the feeder stems, like the Buffalo River, you have to have something to replace. And so now those ecosystems below the dams for so many miles, depending on how big the dam is and how far that changes the temperature structure downriver, those are suited to cold water environments now. The eggs are imported by Game and Fish's approval to the Norfolk trout hatchery over below Norfolk Dam. They are sorted. Someone has to go through, they have to be certified disease-free, and then someone has to go through and they have to pull out all the unfertile eggs. And that takes a huge volunteer effort. So there's other notable influences on fly fishing in the state. I didn't even touch on wapsie fly. In my article on fly fishing in the Encyclopedia of Arkansas, there's some references to Wapsie Fly Company. They're notable because they say, no way for me to verify this, but they say that they sell fly tying materials to fly shops and that are sold to the public, to fly tyers. And they say that every fly virtually in the world has at least one or two materials in it that comes through the doors of Wapsie fly. So they have that kind of influence over the production of flies in the world. And then the Arkansas chapter of Trout Unlimited has, over the years, they've promoted catch and release management of the tailwaters. They went to bat against the Corps of Engineers on low dissolved oxygen issues, water coming out of the dam, because it gets striated, and sometimes if they run too much power in the late fall or late summer or fall, it pulls water off the bottom, which is decomposed matter down there, and as things decompose, it uses up oxygen, and so it pulls up unoxygenated water and discharges into the tailwaters and kills fish. So Trout Unlimited in 1992 went to bat, threatening to sue the Corps of Engineers over this issue and the state. Bill Clinton at the time organized the first dissolved oxygen committee meeting, and since then it's carried on, and they meet twice a year. So that there's coordination between the Corps, the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission, USGS, National Park Service. All these are different agencies on what everyone can do to help contribute to try to make the situation better. Not really arrived at a permanent solution yet. They're still working towards that. It takes money, and it takes someone admitting that, yeah, that's their baby. They've got to correct it. So viable fisheries, where do we go from here? Viable fisheries in Arkansas can only be maintained by active anglers. Fly fishermen have played an important part in conservation agency partnership, and they have a history of influencing the state's fisheries for the better, coming off 100 years ago when we had a depletion of wildlife and fisheries resources. Fishermen have taken a step towards getting involved in conservation efforts, and there's so many different organizations out there now. The Federation of Fly Fishers does education and works on these matters too, and Arkansas Wildlife Federation, Arkansas Canoe Club, all these people that have water interests, have gone to bat at different times for helping to improve the fisheries of the state.